Hi everyone, welcome back to Crime and Wine. As always, my name is Ariana, but you guys can call me Ari. My channel is all about true crime cases where oftentimes, but not all the time, we cover true crime cases that have inspired the making of movies. But today, we're going to be looking at a very interesting and recent crime case that I came across. So, without further ado, grab your wine and let's get into today's case. Today, we're going to be looking into the killing of Brenda Powell. Brenda Powell was a 50-year-old mother and wife who worked as a child life specialist at Akron's Children's Hospital in the Pediatric Oncology Center in Ohio. So basically, Brenda helped with the children who had been diagnosed with cancer and going through all kinds of changes along with the parents of these children. She would help both the children and the parents navigate through these very tough times, and she was really admired among all her employees and patients. Brenda and her husband Stephen got married in 1996 and had their first child, Sydney Powell, on March 21st of 2000. And their second child, Andrew, was soon born just a couple years later. Brenda and her daughter Sydney were very, very close to each other, and they had a really great relationship with each other that most people around them would say. On March 3rd, 2020, one of the most darkest and tragic things occurred to the Powell family. On this day, the police were contacted to do a wellness check on the Powell home, but the ones that called the police to do this wellness check was actually two Mount Union school officials. Well, on March 3rd, the school received a call from Brenda Powell wanting to discuss her daughter Sydney's suspension from the school. And upon being on the phone with the officials, they began to hear what sounded like an attack on Brenda because they said that they had heard repeated thuds and screaming. John Frazier, who was one of the officials on the phone at that time, would later testify that about a minute and a half after the ruckus and then the call ended. He tried calling back, and on his third attempt, Sydney answered the phone, pretending to be her own mother, but apparently the school officials knew it was not Brenda on the phone, so they ended up calling her out on the phone, and she hung up again, and this is when they promptly called the police to the Powell home. At this time, Stephen Powell, Brenda's husband, had received a call from one of his friends, Kenneth Deese, who was also a detective, and he told Stephen that he had heard that the police units had been dispatched to his home and asked if everything was okay. Obviously, this made Stephen hurry and call Brenda and Sydney, and when he spoke to Sydney, she became hysterical and told him that there had been a break-in to their home. Body cam footage from the responding officers showed a disheveled Sydney telling them that there was a noise and that her mother told her to just run, and that's when she heard screaming, and she ended up running back into the house, and there she would find her mother lying on the floor. Sydney also had some minor wounds on herself, which would later be determined that it was from a broken window, in which Sydney told the police that was done by the intruders. Now, of course, this was such an easy case for detectives to conclude that the killing was not done by intruders, but rather horrifically and sadly it was done by Brenda's very own daughter, Sydney Powell. As if Sydney killing her own mother wasn't bad enough, the way in which Brenda was killed, it's just so horrific. Brenda suffered at least 23 stab wounds, primarily to the neck, and several blows to the back of the head by some sort of heavy skillet, which caused the skin on her scalp to be broken. Pictures of her wounds taken at autopsy also showed cuts and bruising to her face, arms, and hands. But what could possibly cause Sydney to brutally murder her own mother? Well, this is where the case gets really interesting because the defense and prosecutors primarily argued whether this was a crime done under reasons of insanity or not. So the foundational reason why Sydney killed her mother that day was sparked when her parents found out that Sydney had actually been expelled from Mount Union University. Stephen, Sydney's father, took the witness stand and explained that earlier that morning on March 3rd of 2020, he had learned that his daughter Sydney had been expelled from Mount Union University. He said that he called his wife to have her handle the crisis with Sydney since, as a child life specialist for an Akron pediatric hospital, she was better skilled at dealing with such matters. She had practiced at de-escalating traumatic, emotionally charged situations, and it appeared that Sydney was not coping well with having lied to them about being in school when in fact she had been suspended for academic failure. He also testified that before Sydney told him about the expulsion, he had already wondered about why the university had not withdrawn his tuition payments, and he also wondered why he couldn't even log into his university's portal to check on his payment status. And when he asked Sydney about it, she would always tell him that it was an error on the university's side. But when he finally learned the truth, he told Sydney that morning that they would be able to work this out and that she just can't keep running away from her problems. So he ended up leaving back to work, and he actually left before Brenda got home. The next thing we know is that Sydney had brutally murdered her mother. But leading up to this, who was Sydney to begin with? Well, Sydney was known as a quiet person that was reserved and she was known as a people pleaser who was extremely smart and was into sports, where she was actually a varsity soccer player. She was also known to have never gotten anything lower than a B in high school and would graduate with a 3.8 GPA, and she was on the honor roll every semester. She also served as a mentor to a lot of the other kids. As far as her relationship with her mother, Brenda, almost every single person who knew the both of them would say that they saw that Brenda and Sydney got along very well and that they were very close. Sydney's father would say that Brenda and Sydney had never once even gotten into any kind of fight, especially not a physical fight. Sydney's best friend since high school and college roommate, Lauren Curry, would describe Sydney as social, charismatic, and even bubbly. She didn't even notice anything was wrong while they were living together, except that at some point Sydney's key card didn't work for a time, and then she learned of Sydney's poor academic performance. For the most part, she thought Sydney was doing well though. And during the summer break between their freshman and sophomore year of college, she said that they had spent time together at home, going to the mall, and doing things that they would normally do. Curry testified that in late February, Sydney told her that she was going to be moving away from the campus, taking a break to just figure things out. The next time that she saw her again was on March 2nd at the sorority's bachelor viewing party. Curry observed nothing wrong then either, testifying that Sydney was just her normal bubbly self. She also said she did not notice anything like blackouts or any weird behaviors. Curry agreed that Sydney studied hard and did not party or get drunk while they were at Mount Union. She also said that Sydney was spending more time alone and that on March 2nd she was pretending that things were normal. Michelle Gaffney and John Fraser, they were the school officials from Mount Union University, where Sydney had been going to school, testified that Sydney was suspended after she failed 3 of her 4 classes in the fall semester of December of 2019. Sydney continued to attend sorority meetings and classes despite receiving written notices of her expulsion, prompting Gaffney and Fraser to meet with her to personally inform her that she would need to move out of her dorm and that her access key card would be terminated. The school administrators said Sydney understood that she had to move out, but she still refused their help in discussing her suspension with her parents and told them that her parents were aware of her situation, and it was only after Sydney's 3rd meeting with them on February 2nd that she then moved out. Lead investigator David Whitten testified that they also received hotel searches in late February. Sydney stayed in hotels for several days and paid cash, all to avoid going home after she was evicted from her dorm. The prosecutors and defense team in this case really tried to focus on every aspect from Sydney's childhood leading up to the day of the murder to explain why or why not Sydney was in a state of a psychotic break. The defense team completely agreed that Sydney killed her mother, but that she was in a psychotic breakdown at the time of the killing and could not, quote, appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. And they also said that since the attack, Sydney had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and was receiving treatment with good results. The defense team used every single angle possible to convince the jury that Sydney was in the midst of a psychotic break at the time of the killing and that she had no idea what she was doing. They called on Dr. James Reardon, who evaluated Sydney in the fall of 2021, and he would be the one to diagnose her with schizophrenia and major depression disorder. Reardon said Sydney told him that she did not recall the attack and only remembered flashes. She said that her last memory of her mother was that they were sitting on the couch and she was comforting her, and she recalled going up and down the stairs of their basement, wanting to get away. According to Dr. Reardon, that was the extent of her recollection of the assault, and her next memory was being at the hospital. Dr. Reardon testified that Sydney was deteriorating and losing her grip on reality in the 3 months leading up to the attack. Her lies to her parents about being enrolled in Mount Union University attending classes when she had actually been suspended was an alternate reality that she lived because her failure was inconsistent with how she viewed herself. Therefore, she denied what was really going on in her life, hoping she could make the falsehood a true reality. Reardon's said that the most relevant evidence was the attack itself, all taking place within 3.5 minutes. The start of the incident marked by the phone call to Brenda Powell at 12:36, and then the follow-up phone call in which Sydney answered pretending to be her own mother, which was only about 4 minutes later. Reardon testified that the lack of motive, spontaneity, and brutality of the attack were all factors that suggested Sydney was in the throes of a psychotic break. He went on to further explain that while she had lost touch with reality, she was still trying to make sense of what was senseless and felt like she had to get away, but by the time of the attack, he said that she was incapable of reasonable thought. He also explained that her psychotic break was one of the most severe that he had ever seen in his 46 years of practice. Another witness for the defense was Dr. Thomas Swally, who was a neuropsychologist, and he testified that Sydney was out of her mind and experiencing psychosis when she attacked her mother. Swally was asked to evaluate Powell in July of 2023 to determine whether she was insane at the time of the murder. After reviewing her medical records, Swally diagnosed Sydney with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, and that she was in an acute psychotic state at the time of the murder. Swally said that Sydney suffered schizophrenic symptoms until May 2020, and then for 4 months after that, she experienced suicidal ideation. Swally said that he administered a series of tests to rule out malingering, which, by the way, means to rule out the possibility that she could be faking any of those. You may have known the definition, but I myself did not, so just wanted to let you guys know. But anyways, he went on to rule out epilepsy or neurological impairment as having caused the criminal conduct at an earlier evaluation in 2021. It's quoted, "Lack of motive for the attack on her mother," and that is what helped persuade Swally that Sydney was insane and could not tell right from wrong at the time of the murder, which, in my opinion, is a bit confusing because I would personally say the motive was not just, her motive was not wanting to face consequences or whatever from her parents for getting kicked out from college, but I mean, to have no motive, I don't know. But in response to everything that the defense team had to present to support their stance, of course, we had the prosecutors who laid out every detail in order to explain why they felt she was not in a state of having a psychotic break at the time. First off, they alleged that Sydney had the presence of mind to stage the crime scene after she killed her mother. Investigator David Borner said blood was found on the outside of the door near the broken window, and that suggested that she broke the window only after a blood-shedding event. She told police that there had been a break-in and that her mother told her to get out. And during the cross-examination from the prosecution team to the defense team's witness, Dr. Reardon actually agreed that it was rare that one would suffer a schizophrenic act out in violence, and even rarer that such patients report symptoms before the age of 13. He also noted that in his assessment that Sydney did tell him that she had experienced auditory hallucinations when she was as young as 11 years old. He also agreed that schizophrenia does not give one a pass in the commission of a crime. Prosecutors also pointed to two significant events during the 3.5-minute attack. Stano noted that Sydney had the presence of mind to also go outside of the house to break the window herself and then later tell the cops that it was an intruder, and she also used two weapons during the attack, retrieving a knife after bludgeoning her mother with a cast iron frying pan. Prosecutors called on another witness in the rebuttal, Dr. Sylvia Obradovich, a clinical psychologist who said that she had interviewed Sydney for 2 hours and diagnosed her with borderline personality traits and unspecified anxiety disorder, and concluded that she was malingering. Obradovich said she did not use any of the tests administered by the defense experts to rule out malingering because they relied on self-reporting. Furthermore, she testified that such tests did not accurately reveal whether someone is insane at the time of the crime, because they were administered years after the homicide. She also disagreed with their diagnosis that Sydney was suffering from a psychotic break due to schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. She says, quote, "The best source of information for an insanity evaluation is what was said and felt at the time of the incident." She explained that she said she took a different approach than the others by examining what she knew to be true and comparing it to Sydney's statements and symptoms. She says, quote, "It just didn't add up to schizophrenia." She said nothing that Sydney had reported that she had began experiencing symptoms as young as 11 years old, which would make her case extremely rare. The psychologist said among women, symptoms of schizophrenia usually surface around mid to late 20s. She also noted that it would have also been very rare for such symptoms to go unnoticed. And a big part of this case too was the body cam footage from the detectives when they arrived on scene, and it would show Sydney appearing to be catatonic, lying down in the driveway, and of course the defense used this to their advantage to show she was insane. When defense attorney Don Malarsick played for jurors a clip of Sydney's behavior after the police arrived on the scene, it showed that she was erratic and hysterical initially, but then when ground, she just laid there in the fetal position, catatonic, and appeared unable to respond to questions. The prosecutor's witness, Dr. Sylvia, said that Sydney was suffering from the shock after the trauma of killing her mother. Catatonic, she said, was not something that one could slip in and out of. Rather, the condition usually lasts at least 24 hours to several days. She also disputed that Sydney had motive to kill her mother, saying that Sydney was willing to kill her mother because she would do anything to keep from disappointing her. I just find the rebuttals between the defense and the prosecutors extremely interesting because they really do bring the best arguments forward, and it could be difficult to not see each side's point of view. I have never been on a jury, but I can imagine how incredibly tough that might be. But leave your initial thoughts in the comments below, whether you think the defense or the prosecutors made a better argument or made more sense. Let me know what you guys think. On September 20th of 2023, the jury found Sydney Powell guilty on all counts, including count 1, purposeful murder, count 2, felony murder, and count 3, felonious assault, and count 4, tampering with evidence. And on September 28, 2023, the judge sentenced Sidney Powell to an indefinite sentence of 15 years to life in prison. The attorney that represented the Powell family said that the rest of the family, including Sidney's father, Stephen Powell, didn't want her to even go to trial for murder in the first place, but that their main concern is that Sidney receives the mental health treatment and placement that she needs. Currently, as of lately, Stephen Powell has written a letter to the judge stating that he wants his daughter Sidney sent to a mental health facility rather than the Ohio State Reformatory for Women in Maryville, where she has already began serving her sentence. It is said that Sidney plans to appeal her sentence at some point in the future. Well, this was a very unfortunate case, and I'm glad that there was some sort of justice for Brenda Powell. But yeah, don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments down below and let me know what case you guys would like me to cover next. I really do enjoy reading the comments, so if there's a current trending case that you'd want me to dive in and get all the details and tell you guys about it, then let me know. But other than that, thank you guys so much for joining me back here for another episode. Also, make sure to click the link to follow me on my new Instagram account. It's all crime and wine. You'll get some sneak peeks into the coming cases. I'll also be doing some quick sip crimes, which is just some crimes that are in the headlines or that have happened recently, and it's just going to be like a overview of those cases. So yeah, definitely follow me there, connect with me. I'd like to get to know who my subscribers are. So thank you guys again, and I'll see you guys back here next week.